Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Cindy Bloom. If you recall recent political history, you know the name Paul Ryan. He is former chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, former Speaker of the House. And at this year's Global Tax Symposium, we had a chance to speak with him about the future of tax policy, working with the divided government, and the 2024 presidential election, and whether he's going to run. Here's Chairman Dave Camp's interview with him. Enjoy.
Paul, it's good to see you.
Good to see you too, Dave.
Thank you for joining us on Policy on Demand. We obviously have just had the election. We have a Democratic president. We have a Democratic Senate and a Republican House. And what do you see as the opportunities for passing legislation in that environment?
The stuff that has to get done because of some deadline will get done and not much else. The one thing I'd say is I do think there'll be more China legislation. Both parties are basically China hawk parties now. I think American foreign policy is kind of going down the path, not unlike George Kennan and containment in the Soviet Union and Soviet containment policy, where you had Democrats and Republicans agreeing on it, different flavors of the policy, but the same core policy. I think you're going to get the same kind of policy on China, which is both parties are going to be sort of China hawks. That means you'll have another round of sort of what I would call decoupling legislation. We had the CHIPS Act, which was a decoupling on fabs and semiconductors. My guess is you'll go down that supply chain and some other vertical supply chains where we believe it's in our national security interest to decouple ourselves from China. I think you'll have a lot of committee work on that, and I think you'll have more legislation on that. People talk about a new reverse CFIUS. How do you deny sort of investment going into China that is not good for our foreign policy? And then I think you're going to have more national security policy on China with respect to private enterprise. How do we stop China from taking data, cross-border data flow issues, things like that I think are going to be where we spend a lot of our time. And then the only other thing that I think you'll see legislation on, because it's sort of necessary, is crypto. I think Patrick McHenry at the Financial Services Committee will hold the pen on a new law for Web3 on how to write a securities law for this new technology of blockchain. Given the FTX fiasco and the implosion there, given the fact that this is growing in markets overseas, in order to have a Web3 ecosystem in America and the hyperscale firms that might emerge from that to be American, and the Internet of money and assets being American, you're going to have a pretty good law defining the rules of this game and giving enough breathing room for innovation to occur. I think you'll see a Web3 law. So that's probably the newest, biggest thing that's going to happen because it has to happen. Then it's going to be China, and then it's going to be just must-pass stuff. Deadline-driven things like appropriations, debt limits, things like that.
And obviously with the 60-vote margin needed in the Senate for anything, there will need to be bipartisanship. And, having worked on large pieces of legislation like tax reform and when you were in Congress, what's changed about trying to get some of those big things done between the time you were there and now?
We've become more polarized, more partisan. I think each of our parties have more sort of extreme members who sort of want to own the other side and cannot compromise with the other side. You and I were legislators. We believed that the way to rise through Congress is through a meritocracy, and the way we measured our success was persuasion and innovation. Could we come up with good policies like the Camp draft? Could we come up with good policies, and then could we persuade people these were the right policies? Our constituents, our colleagues, the country. There's a whole new raft of members of Congress from both parties that don't measure success that way. They measure success through provocation and entertainment. They are what I call the entertainment wing of the party. And so if you're coming to Congress to sort of engage in more performance art, to be an entertainer, to be a celebrity, you have to curate your own brand. And that brand requires you to curate it with your own people, your own base, your own cul-de-sac, your own web, followership, your own digital footprint, not compromising. So we've got a lot of people in Congress who are in those silos that makes it a little harder for big things to happen, for big bipartisan deals to happen. All the more reason why the people who are in the center right and the center left are going to have to figure out how to get stuff done. And I think that's going to be a machination that people are going to go through, because what happens is everybody has a base in their district. And you don't want to throw your base overboard because you can't stitch together a vote coalition. And if you have entertainers telling your base that you are a sellout, that you shouldn't be compromising, it makes governing a lot harder. So that's why I just think the things that will get done are the things that must get done. And then only the things that we all sort of agree on, like China policy, maybe a new Web3 law. Other than that, I think it's going to take a clarifying presidential election to get through this stalemate we have.
So what do you think that means for tax policy going forward?
I think it's going to be status quo for the next 2 years. You've got a bunch of expiring provisions in 2025. Those provisions probably won't get extended until the last minute. So you're going to go right up to the deadline of expiring provisions to reconcile what's going to happen to those things. Or you'll just have quick little extenders. So I really think it's going to take another clarifying presidential election. We should do better, Republicans in the Senate next year, just based on who's up for re-election. So if things go well for our party, we have a really good chance of getting the Senate majority, improving our House majority, and then let's see what happens with the presidency. We could have a good election. We could also have a bad election. But my point is the 2024 presidential election is going to shake things up, break these impasses, and it's going to be an election where the country's going to choose which path it wants to go down. And then after that, in my opinion, you'll have some stuff passed that has to pass because we just can only have this sort of stalemate for so long.
There's been a lot of activity at the OECD in the last few years. What are your thoughts on international taxation?
Yeah, I am not a fan of a global min tax. I am not a fan of what Janet Yellen's trying to do at the OECD. I've always subscribed to the tax competition school of thought, not the tax harmonization school of thought. I think countries should compete with each other on economic vitality and competitiveness. So I've always sort of taken the Irish, side of this debate in Europe. So the book I just recently released as a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute with other people proposes a destination-based cash flow tax with a carbon tax on top of it that's border adjustable. I believe that's a smarter way to go for our country, which puts us on sort of a flywheel of tax competition, but gets us in a way where countries can compete with one another with destination-based taxation. I think that's a smarter way to go. And I think it helps produce faster global economic growth because it encourages countries to have the most pro-economic growth tax regimes in place. You go down this global min tax route, and I think you're going to actually damage what we could otherwise have as faster economic growth.
So what advice do you have for businesses and companies that are trying to navigate this new Republican majority and a Democratic Senate?
Yeah. Be involved, get engaged, get to know, if you're a company, get to know your local members of Congress. Do it before you need something. Do it before you have a problem. Do it before, some issue comes to a fruition. So I think it's extremely important to get engaged. Be a resource to members of Congress. I found it extremely helpful, especially when I became a chairman of a committee, let alone Speaker of the House, to just understand how the economy worked by talking to the CEOs and the officers of corporations that employed a lot of my employees or people from my state or just people around the country. It's really important that CEOs and C-suite people communicate with members of Congress so that they understand each other much better. Out of sight, out of mind, and what's going to happen with congressional oversight, what's going to happen with the politics of corporations, on woke corporations and ESG and all of that. There's going to be a lot of politics involved. And if you're not in Congress, talking with members of Congress, building relationships, making sure that they understand exactly who you are and what you do, they're going to just assume. They're going to just make assumptions. And that could end poorly for a lot of companies. So I think it's extremely important for companies in this day and age to get involved with members of Congress at an early stage so that you have some relationships.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Paul.
You bet.
Great to be with you.
Nice to see you again.